I'm speaking today with Hilda Mwangi. Hi, Hilda.
Hi, Danielle. How are you?
Doing all right. How are you?
Hanging in there, all things considered. Thanks for asking.
Maybe you'll start by introducing yourself and talking a little bit about yourself.
Sure. My name's Hilda Mwangi, and based here now in San Diego, California, but I'm originally from Kenya. My parents' sister and I moved to Baltimore on the East Coast in 1997. So we've been in the U.S. for quite a number of years. And then that's where I went to school, started working, and then eventually my jobs moved me out west. So I've been out in California since 2014 and in San Diego since 2017.
What do you do today?
Today, I work for a multinational pharmaceutical company, basically doing communications and operations.
Let me ask you, as you and I spoke, what was it like maybe a week ago, a little bit more? You were talking about your experience. What was it like to growing up Black in America for you? Tell a little bit, what was it like for you, and especially with your parents moving from Kenya?
So just to set some context, I was 10 at the time. And, it all happened very quickly. I was in school, regular old kid. And then schools in Kenya close April, August, and December for holidays. So April, my sister and I finished school as we normally would, not knowing we would not go back. So we had no idea about any of this. My mother had applied for the diversity visa lottery, which is what people call the green card lottery. Fuzzy enough found out that my dad did not know she was doing that. She did that because there's a chance he might not get it. So she didn't want to raise a fuss. She got it. And then had the conversation about, this is good for our children. Are you with me or not? Either way, I'm on that plane. And so my sister and I, again, finished school as we normally would. And then about end of April is when my mom told us, in about 2 weeks, you will be on a plane and we'll be going to the United States.
Wow.
And so, luckily we were able to go back to school and say goodbye to our friends. So that was that. We moved. My mom took us to a relative's place. We stayed there while she packed up the house, and that was it. And then, she went back about 2 weeks after we arrived to go close out the rest of our affairs. But the first things first were, you move here, you get enrolled in school. So luckily for us, we had an aunt and uncle here previously. And so my aunt really did everything about, informing us about how schools got registered. She had to educate herself about that because she also didn't have kids. So she did all the groundwork with us to figure out where we would live, which schools we would be attending, how my dad would apply for things like a driver's license. I mean, all these things, social security cards, all these things that resettlement requires of you. So it was quite the education. And I got to say, I was pretty much a grown-up little kid growing up from a young age, but this forced all of us to grow up. There was no coddling around this. Everybody had to lift something, right? Which is a lot to ask of a 10-year-old. It was quite a bit, but it wasn't my first trip internationally. My first trip internationally was when I was 7. We went to the United Kingdom. Coming from a country where you're the majority, it wasn't a shock, as people would say, living in a majority white country. That was not a shock. Luckily, we had been exposed to that before, so this was kind of just part of it. But it was definitely a cultural change. The language, how people speak, driving on the other side of the road. I mean, the little things, the grocery store experiences, the school experience. And this is actually where we first got introduced to the differences that we would later come to learn and understand happened within the first, I would say, 2 weeks of our arrival.
Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so we went to the school that my aunt had found. It was a local school, a local middle school. So when we moved, I was in 5th grade. And when we got here, it was mid-May. It was like May 17th, I think. So the schools had about 1 week to close. So we got there just in time to talk to somebody in the guidance office and the vice principals about registering us. And that's when they said, well, we have to go take testing for English speakers as a second language to test in to get into the school. And we all looked at each other like, what? What do you mean? I've spoken English since I was 2, right? But okay, let's go with it. I was a straight A student in Kenya. we had to get our grades reaccredited. Came to find out our course system was more rigorous, but you don't get the benefit of the doubt because you're coming from an African country. So we had to take the test. My sister and I scored so highly in the English test, they wondered why we got sent there. So we passed that hurdle. And then the education one, my sister and I will both skip to the next grade. So I never actually finished 5th grade. She never finished 6th grade. But upon entry, there was no benefit of the doubt that we could possibly be that smart. And then to make it worse, I got put into gifted and talented. My sister was put in standard. She was so bored in her first 2 weeks of school, my dad had to go into the school and get her reassessed. And she ended up in the honors section. But it showed us then that you have to be an advocate for yourself, that you had to fight, that if you thought you were smarter than you were being adjudicated for, you had to fight for that. And not until I had the conversation with you last week did I realize the context of that. That why would that happen? Why would you have such a low expectation? But it came to me that nobody knew that Kenya was a British colony. Therefore, it's not like I'm coming from West Africa where French is my first language. English was my first language. So that was interesting that the ignorance around British colonialism would not give you the benefit of the doubt. I was like, we're a more recent colony than the United States was. Right?
Let me ask this. So if you would have gone to the UK, this wouldn't have happened to you?
I'm not sure if it would or it wouldn't have. I think my parents definitely have certain experiences that they probably have not even told me about. Both of them were educated in the UK. That's where they met. And so I don't know what extensive kind of qualifications and hurdles they had to prove and go through. But I will tell you this. My mother was an educator for 26 years in Kenya and had retired twice from her profession. Full-time educator her whole entire career. Could not qualify as a teacher here. Couldn't even qualify as a substitute teacher here. And mind you, she has put countless of people through the system, people who are leaders in Kenya today, bank managers, etc., and could not get the benefit of the doubt.
Why do you think this is the case?
There's a belief that unless a school is an American school and accredited by whatever accreditation system, right? So if you go within the curriculum, different schools are, certified by certain accreditation bodies. And that's how they make their money, right? Is to accredit schools and say that this school is compliant, XYZ. My mother had a master's from the UK, from Leeds University. And you're telling me that a UK education is not valued in the US? That's ridiculous. In that case, all the Oxford and Rhodes scholars would be sitting on paperweight, right? So Oxford's good enough, but Leeds University is not good enough. So that boggles the mind. That really boggled the mind. But again, we didn't know enough at that time because this was about 1997, 98, 99. We didn't know enough about the history of racism in this country to understand the context of what was happening. So, you just take it on the chin and you keep going because at that moment, what you're trying to do is to find your next profession to be able to support your family. So do you sit there and have a deep think about why this is happening to you? Or do you pivot because you need to find a way to provide for your 2 children and the rest of your family?
Let me ask you this. How would you compare your experience in Kenya to coming to the US from a standpoint of being treated differently? What were the early experiences of that in the US and how would it compare?
I think from the onset, I think the fundamental difference is to understand that when you're born into a place, you don't have the second guessing you do than when you move to a place. So growing up, I grew up in the comfort of what I always knew, right? Because from the age of 0 to 10, I didn't have to adjust, right? I was born into it. So my only adjustment was when I was a very little child. Here, it was, you come to a place, first of all, I had never been sat down by my parents when we closed school to say, this is what America is like, this is what we do or don't do, da-da-da. There was no time for that. My mother was too busy packing up our belongings to have that chat. And like I said, we were moved out of our home so she could prep. So in that case, when we got to the country, there was no real level setting of, you do this, you do that. So my sister and I were always just very cautious. So you go outside, you walk around, we would walk around, we would drive around just to kind of get our bearings. Where are we? You know, we would read a lot, right? The first thing I think we did was get a library card. Once we could figure out how to get a library card, we did. Because we always found safety in learning through books, right? Instead of through an experience. You're going to read first, study a situation, and then do it. It's different because in Kenya, you grow up, you're born. You walk there, you crawl there, you run there, you ride your bike there. And you're in the majority. Again, so at that age, all I knew, and I grew up on a school compound, on my mom's school compound where she was a headmistress. My understanding of life and people was in the form of a higher education school compound. It was in a high school, so there were students. I understood from a very young age who my mother was. She was the head of that school. So I was in a position of being teased and bullied by the students as the way to get to their headmistress, my sister and I. We grew up in a situation where there were no other kids. So the only other kids were the kids of other staff members who lived on the compound with us. So if you think of a military base and say your father is the naval commander and the only other children were the children of other officers. That was my upbringing. I would have to run up from the house to her office to see my mom because she kept really crazy hours, 4 a.m. to midnight. But everybody around me looked like me. I never once had a thought about they don't look like me, right? They were all Black. There was not a single white person, not a single white teacher, student, etc. But I did grow up knowing what a boarding school was from the age of 2. I grew up knowing that my mother was a working mother. I grew up with a nanny. I grew up with house help because that is just the system we grew up in. I grew up with a father who worked outside the home and traveled for work. So I'd see him on weekends. Then we moved and the situation flipped. I lived with my father. My mother commuted to see us. I learned from a young age that I can have 2 committed parents and not be in the same house with both of them. And that just meant that they were making ends meet. So there was, again, my play friends were my nannies and our house help. Those are the people who literally parented me most of the time. And then coming here, there was no house help. There was no nanny. There was definitely a lot more caution because you're learning how to navigate this new place. Luckily, my dad was the adventurous one, so he would always take us on walks and explain things and ask us what we're processing. And like I said, we were grown-up little kids, right? So we would always endeavor to be helpful in the house. So we took up chores at a very young age. But you definitely notice some differences. So in Kenya, you'd get your hair done every 2 weeks or so. And we lived in an estate kind of community where you have a bunch of houses that all look alike, kind of like a development. But there's a shopping center where there's a hair place, food place, all these kinds of things. That wasn't the case in suburbia Baltimore, right? There were all these communities, but you couldn't just walk to the place to get your hair done. We didn't even know where to get our hair done. When we first moved, we had braids. In the first month, my mom was back in Kenya closing things up. My dad had to take our braids out. And for an African man, this has never happened. My dad, in his 30-something years of life, 40-something years of life, had never taken out the braids of a woman in his family. It would be an anathema for that to be happening. But he's the father of 2 girls, and that's what it means to parent. And that's what it means when mom's not here, and there's no community, and he didn't even know where to start. So there he was with 2 girls taking our hair out. So these were some of the small things that we noticed early on being different. Because in Kenya, what would happen, this is how the conversation would go. Dad, I got to get my hair done. So he talks to our nanny and says, how much? Here, the end. That's how the conversation would go. And somebody would take us and that would be it. So it was definitely a change. My father was cooking. I don't think I'd ever seen my father cook before that. And thank God he knew how to cook. Thank God, because I don't know. I don't know how he would have made it. But there was a change. And we became cautious because we were just in a new place. And my parents talked to us about, not talking to strangers and opening the door and all these things. But yeah, we were resilient. We made friends in the community. One of my oldest friends actually is a Nigerian girl, and they lived in the apartment across from us. And I was just thinking to myself this weekend, the best experience that came from all of this is my ability to meet other immigrants and realize just how similar our stories are. but it gave me an exposure to people of other countries that in Kenya I never would have been exposed to. In Kenya, I wouldn't have a Nigerian best friend. I wouldn't have a Chinese best friend. I wouldn't know the Nigerian customs and traditions and holidays. And that has made all of this so rich, is to be able to have that connectivity globally with so many people.
I can totally relate to that. Let me ask you this. How welcoming was the local community? And what are some of the things that you encountered when you were trying to integrate into local community? And what are the things that you might face that you absolutely didn't expect?
Again, it's very different in the lens of a child. And I think you've encouraged me to have these conversations with my parents where we can talk about what I saw and see how they saw it differently. Because as a child, I'm only internalizing based on the context that I have. So for example, our welcoming community coming here were other Kenyans, right? I had an aunt here, I had an uncle, both on my mom's side, and they were very generous. My aunt at the time was dating her now husband. So she moved in with him to vacate her apartment for us. And that's something that I don't think a lot of people get, because a lot of people will move into a host family's house and you're living all together. She gave us the privacy and the autonomy of her entire apartment for us to live as a unit. And it was within walking distance, so that was great. The friends she had made became our immediate community of friends and family. So they're the ones who invited us to cookouts. They're the ones who invited us to holidays, right? Christmas, helping us understand what Thanksgiving is, because you're out of school, but you don't know what this holiday is even about. So they really were it. It became a challenge because some people in the Kenyan community are not part of the Catholic faith. I grew up Catholic. And so, again, my mom's back in Kenya, so my dad has to do all these things. So he found us a Catholic church nearby, and one of the ladies in the Kenyan community took us for our first several services. It could not have been a more cold atmosphere in that church. It just couldn't have been. And the overtures were just so veiled and subtle that as a child, I didn't understand them, but my dad did. He could tell when, you were not welcome, because he had experienced these very same things in the UK when he was younger. So he knew what veiled and subtle racism looked like. Whereas for me as a child, I'm just thinking, people are just not friendly, and that's that. Because in Kenya, it's quite the opposite. Anybody who's new to a church, first of all, you're noticed right away because everybody knows everybody. But two, everybody goes out of their way to welcome you and to make you feel welcome, almost to the point that you start thinking they're nosy. But here was the complete opposite. And it was so unwelcoming that for the duration of our time in Baltimore, I think for about 18 years, we would drive 40 minutes to a church that we found to be hospitable.
And what was that other church?
It was also a Catholic church, but it was presided by a priest who had very many encounters within the immigrant community and had gone on several sabbaticals and missions within Africa, Kenya in particular. And so he created a community. It started with him. He created the community that put immigration and social justice at the center of its ministry. And till this day, it continues. And what ended up happening is one by one, the Kenyans started telling each other, anybody who was Catholic, that was a church to be in. And next thing you know, we all know each other. There was a choir group called the Wasafiri Voices that my cousin was in, formed by Kenyans. And they eventually ended up having a Swahili mass service once a month. And he created the space for them to do that, to realize that people are missing their native language. And so long as you got enough of a community to attend that service, he provided the forum for you. So these were some of the things that we realized that even when I moved out west, I missed. Because now I had to do that all over again. I had to find that church that would be welcoming, because faith was such a big part of our lives. And we missed that. But it was so clear when we first moved, that church was not welcoming in any way. And when we finally found St. Matthew's, the second church, it was a world of difference, a world of difference. I mean, they've hosted Kenyan priests. They've hosted a Kenyan archbishop there when he came. I mean, it has become that place of refuge for so many Kenyans, but other immigrants from other places in the world. And also, people thought, oh, the white population will surely flee because this is not what they're about. But those who were about social justice and those who cared for other immigrants found a home there too, because this is also the time when the church was a refuge for anybody who, for example, was undocumented, right? Churches have always served that role. And so this was such a beacon in the Baltimore community. And this is in Baltimore City, mind you. So again, we're driving 40 minutes every Sunday. And yet the other church was 10 minutes from our house.
I feel like African American is a lot more applicable to you than to a lot of people who've been living for generations here, because they have very little affinity to Africa. Do you feel like you were treated differently just because you immigrated from Africa recently, as opposed to Black people who grew up here or who've been here for generations?
Yes and no. So no, because you don't know what I am until I say something. And in the early days especially. So I remember going to school and a classmate of mine used to make fun of how I pronounced things because I still had an accent. And I still said things like aluminium. Until you say aluminium, does somebody understand that you're not from here? And so there's always that misconception of I'm different because I'm Kenyan. You don't know that until I tell you that. You don't know that until I speak. And so I have been treated differently because I'm grouped, right? Anybody, and I think we've seen this a lot recently. Anybody who's Black is presumed to be African American because we don't know otherwise. But on the other hand, you get treated differently in the opposite direction once people get to know you, because next thing I got was a lot of, oh, you're so articulate comments. Oh, you're so eloquent. Oh, you're not like the other Blacks. I mean, just, so on the one hand, you got some of the people who thought you're probably going to be lazy, your mom's probably a single mom, et cetera, et cetera. And then the other ones, once they hear you speak or see your writing or see your work, and it's like, oh my God, you're so articulate. Where did you learn to speak English so well? Colonial history. And then there was also the other thing of once people knew you were Kenyan, the other form of racism is, did you live in a hut? Did you live on a tree? Did you have a pet elephant? You get it all. You get it all. So there are times when you get, benefit of the doubt from how well you speak, and all of a sudden you're not that kind of Black. And then other times where it's like, nope, you're lumped with every other stereotype that people get unfairly. That's been the difficult part, right? And when we first moved, we didn't understand this either, was the chasm between African Americans and Africans. Because once we got here, that's when you start hearing the derogatory remarks within the African community about African Americans. They're lazy. They don't work hard. They're criminal. I mean, literally every stereotype that has been peddled through media, movies, etc. Don't forget, Kenyans don't watch, Kenyan movies per se. They watch American movies.
So those were the stereotype within Kenyan community towards Black people who lived
are native here.
Okay.
So you're coming from Kenya with whatever the media has peddled since you are a child, right? So if you imagine people in Kenya are watching the exact same movies that come out here in whatever context. So however people visualize African Americans here, the world is getting fed the same stereotypes. The whole world. I also get this now as an American with an American passport as I travel abroad, right? I get that because again, nobody knows that I'm Kenyan. But as long as I have an American passport, I'm now another African American based on whatever stereotypes, have been peddled to that country.
Hilda, you just raised a very good point that I don't think I've heard mentioned by anybody else. And that is the stereotype of Black people in America being propagated for decades to the outside world from Hollywood movies, about violence, about crime, but even maybe some mass media and like TV and so on and so on. Yeah. And some of the perception of the outside world towards America is based on these movies and on the TV, which in most cases has very little to do with reality. It's just like with everything else. Exactly. A lot of us came to America, and me the same way, watching a lot of Hollywood movies and thinking that's what America's like. This is a very, very profound point. I think it's very important for a lot of people to understand, especially outside of America,
Yeah, I think you're 100% right. So think about that in the inverse. What do you know about Africa, if not the Live Aid and the missionary advertisements, right? The kid who's always has flies around them. It's always, people who live on 30 cents a day, right? Everything people know about Africa is either coming to America, the Lion King, or these missionary videos, these, Christian missionary videos about donating to people who are poor and, suffering from dirty drinking water. And these things exist. They do. But it's the foundation that there's no other side to that coin. There's no display of affluence. There's no display of education and how people are educated there. There's no display of how hardworking people are. And then again, this lumping together of Africa. What is Africa? It's an entire continent. My country is not the same as the country right next door to it in exact form. There's not even a differentiation in this. It's Africa. I'm like, so you're saying all of Africa has kids with flies all, come on. So it works in the same way. And to your point, even good stereotypes. We all think it looks like Hollywood till you get here, or till you walk Hollywood Boulevard in LA, and you're like, this is it? And you're like, oh, okay. Yep. And you realize you're like, oh, Kenya was better than this, right? Because you're finally here and you realize the dream you were sold. So it works in all ways. It works in good stereotypes, bad stereotypes, but until you realize that there was that communication and dialogue about Kenyans, seeing themselves a certain way, African Americans being seen a certain way in the Kenyan community. Then you also learn how African Americans see Africans in general because of that attitude of being looked down upon.
And what is that like?
It was always this thing of, oh, they're better than us, meaning African Americans will look at Africans thinking, oh, they're better than us, right? So again, it's this idea of, because you don't share the same history, all of a sudden you feel like you're removed from it. Their issues are not your issues, because they probably, they would have done something to have brought that onto themselves. And again, that's what I've grown to realize living here so long is the outside world doesn't care for that. It doesn't matter. So it doesn't behoove me to stand aside and say, oh, this looks like an African American problem. Again, fact is, I am seen as one, no matter what. So standing on the sidelines, acting like this is their fight, I don't need to join it, is false. And it's deadly. Because when it's my turn to be on the other side and I want support, I don't want my African American brothers and sisters to stand on the sidelines and say, but that's a Kenyan problem.
Yeah, it's great because I recently interviewed Charles McPherson. I don't know if you know him, as a jazz legend who lives in San Diego. And he mentioned old saying about, when they came for me, there was nobody left, right?
Exactly.
So that's kind of that, right? So if you see injustice around, do something about that, because if you just keep sitting and waiting, one day they'll come for you, and there will be nobody left to help. Yeah.
And I think I think there's also a distinction to be made. Prior generations came for educational attainment, and they left, right? So I'm talking about Barack Obama's father's generation. My mother's
That's actually
generation.
a question I was going to ask you. Perfect. That's great.
Yeah.
Yes.
So they came for educational attainment. My mother went to school in the UK. My dad went to school in the UK. My mom had been in America before that, but they went back. So you had a generation that believed in post-independence generations, right? The 1960s generation, to go to school, get the opportunity, and come back to their countries and lead them in the post-independence era, because you were transitioning from colonial governments to native governments. And that's what happened with Kenya's first president, second president, etc. You're now so those are the generations that didn't necessarily join in the fight for civil rights, because they were like, I'm here to put my head down, get my education, mind my business, and go home. So those are not necessarily the people that stuck in that fight. Fast forward to my generation and my sister's generation, the 80s, 90s immigrants. It's kind of starting to look like people might not go home. People might come out here and get green cards and settle in. And yet, they have 1 foot in, 1 foot out, because the chances are they came when they were in college, right? You're still not being born here just yet. You're still coming here to get a college education. And some get married here and just don't leave. But they still have a foot out. They still have, a family in Kenya. They still have investments in Kenya, etc. So they're not completely bought into the society here yet. Late 90s, 2000s. I think we have better opportunities out here. I don't think we're going to go back. We start having kids here. Definitely those kids are not going back. They don't know any different. So now we start getting into the here and now of, this is not their fight or my fight. This is an everybody fight, because where else am I going, right? My parents moved back for retirement, and you can see why they were not part of the fight, because they always intended to go back for retirement. I'm not there, right? So I'm invested in this fight, because this fight actively affects me every single day in a way that I don't have to do that in Kenya. And so I'm invested in this fight, because I can't possibly say that it's somebody else's job to do this work and for me to just benefit in it. It's not right. It's not okay. And I have to be an example to my younger cousins who are 100% first-generation Americans. They don't have another home. Yes, they have the option to go to Kenya where their parents are from. They don't even speak the languages. They don't know anything else. This is it. This is it for them.
Let me ask you this. So do you think it was part of the challenges with Barack Obama that he wasn't quite seen by the Black community in the US as one of them, that he was seen a little bit different as somebody who was born to somebody who came from Kenya?
Not necessarily. So I think his challenge was different in the sense that I think everybody knew his father was not the most present person in his life. He was by and large raised by his mother and his grandparents, and his books articulate that. I don't think that was the issue. I think the issue, again, is there's still this chasm of, do you trust people who have reached a certain level of educational attainment? Can you be highly educated and still hold street cred, right? Because it's interesting that I found it comical that when we first came here, Bill Clinton was president, and people called Bill the first Black president. What gave him the street cred, right? What about it? Was it his swagger, how he spoke, that he played a saxophone? I don't know. To this day, I haven't found somebody to explain to me why Bill was considered the first Black president of America. And he still had this affinity, despite all the laws that he passed, criminal justice, all this stuff. He still holds such an affinity within the community. Equally for Barack Obama, I don't know that his parentage helped or hurt. I mean, definitely he, like every other mixed race person, has identified and felt, is they don't know where they belong, neither here nor there. You're not white enough to be white. You're not Black enough to be Black. And I gotta say, even being 100% Kenyan and Black, I've faced that. I'm not Black enough because I will talk white. I will, these are the stereotypes I would get as a kid in school. I talk white, so the Black kids would not accept me. But I'm Black, so the white kids wouldn't accept me, even though I talk white. So his thing, I think, also was there was such a high level and a bar for him, right? Him singing Amazing Grace at the Charleston funeral, is that what it takes for us to feel that he's one of us? Is his swagger what we need to make him feel like he's one of us? But what is it he has to do to make the white community feel safe that he represents them as well? It is untenable, and it is something that no white president has been asked to do.
But it's interesting that I think who you are and where you came from gives you an edge to look at the situation and what's going on a little bit from the outside and maybe uncover things that others who are in the middle of it might not be able to see. Would you agree with that?
I would. And I think part of that is because I come from pure innocence and ignorance, right? Pure ignorance. I don't know what I don't know, so it forces me to learn. So, for example, when we start talking about the 13th Amendment, it doesn't start with the 13th Amendment for me, in terms of ensuring that Black people are no longer seen or treated as slaves or subjected to slavery in any form. It was, where did that come from? What precipitated the 13th Amendment? And it takes me back, right? So I start going backwards. It is different because I think there's a component of past history. I think when you're part of a history, you fill in the blanks based on what you were told. It doesn't necessarily lend for your own independent research to independently educate yourself, independent of what you were told. So, for example, have I gone through Kenya's history? No, I've settled with what I was told, right? Whereas here, I'm inquisitive. Why did that happen to us? What did we do to deserve that treatment? And then it forces us again to go to the library and look at what is the history that would cause such treatment? What is the history of this country that would lead to this event, to this statement, to this stereotype, to this treatment? And I think that's the thing about coming from the outside is you don't know what you don't know. So everything is bound on curiosity. If you're part of it, you have to imagine that there could be another truth outside of what you have grown up with, outside of what you have been told, and a curiosity that there's more to that than just what you were told. And I think that's what people are discovering, I think, in the last week of, what do you mean there was a Juneteenth? It's always been here. But because nobody ever taught you, you never questioned. You just never questioned. And people are like, if it wasn't for this period, we wouldn't know it exists. I think you're right. It's always been there. Juneteenth has been here this entire time. And it was funny, when somebody said, when the president said last week, oh, I made it famous. And somebody said, sir, we've put out a proclamation every one of your 3 years. It's like, yeah, even you didn't know you've been supporting something.
For sure. Let me shift gears for a moment and actually talk a little bit about what it's like to be a Black woman. I think a lot of conversation that has been in quite a few people that I interviewed were men, and there's a lot of thing that goes with it, and that's being extra careful when you pulled over by police, knowing that everything that's been going on and things that you have to be extra careful saying or not saying, some implicit or sometimes explicit racism that a lot of Black men face. But what is it like to be a Black woman? What are some of the things that you had to experience being here, and also things that you've observed or noticed regarding the way Black women are treated?
I think it was James Baldwin that wrote about the status of Black women in America. Something along the lines of, there literally could not be another rung below the status of a Black woman. They are, in so many ways disregarded, mistreated, and yet, right? You'll hear this a lot from Black women, and yet. All this happens to us, and yet. It's different also coming from an immigrant perspective, right? So matriarchs are a big deal. So Kenya is a patriarchal society, so men rule the day. But growing up, it was never a doubt to me, the power that women held. The organization, the systems of how our family worked. I grew up with a mother who was the breadwinner, more educated than my father, older than my father, made more money than my father in the initial instance. Things have flipped. So I never grew up thinking I didn't come from strong women. Fast forward, move here, and you start learning. So in Kenya, I did have some family members who were single mothers. So I also understood the power of women who are left to raise 4 or 5 kids by themselves. Come here and you understand, mass incarceration and what that does to the families here. And just how many women have dreams deferred, right, are all of a sudden catapulted into single parenting and what they must do and go through to get their kids to the next level. The community that it takes to raise these children, the idea of a big mama, right? A Medea, a big mama, as the South would have it. The idea that they were the glues, and you saw this time and time again when the matriarch dies, the family falls apart. She was a person that mandated Sunday dinners and all these things. And so, again, media colors that image of what Black womanhood looks like. Then you grow up a little bit more, and then you start looking at how women are portrayed in movies, in music videos, and all this, how hypersexualized and fetishized Black women bodies are. And that lends to a lot of shame as you are developing in your teen years, right? If you have certain dimensions to your body, it could lead to pride or shame, depending on how you want to look at it. Because those are the catcalls you get on the street, right? There's this idea that Black women are just hypersexualized people, and that's historical. That's not recent. That is historical. And so people almost have a certain expectation of how you act, as if you couldn't possibly be a proper lady, right? So that comes into the scene when you're dating. When you think about the conversations, like you said, about, Black boys go through the conversation of being stopped by the police. I think the case of Sandra Bland showed that even women have to get this conversation. We're not safe. But what this showed more and more is, especially now with Breonna Taylor, we have to keep pounding the pavement and say, don't forget about her. We have all galvanized behind George Floyd and Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown and Philando Castillo and Eric Garner, all men. All men. What happened to Sandra Bland? What happened to Breonna Taylor? What happened to Tatiana Jefferson? Who remembers them? And we have to keep fighting for them. The young lady who was murdered last week, who was an activist, right? And the fact that she was assaulted before that. That is, above and beyond just being killed, she was assaulted. When you look at the plight of these mothers, of these slain men, they have to continue. They are the bedrock of their families. And so you look at that and you say, when do Black women stop? When is it okay for them to cry? When is it okay for them to get help mentally? Because they still have to continue on for the kids that remain. It's a heavy burden. And on top of it, you're not making as much money, right? So you're doing all this and you have to work multiple jobs just to keep up financially. It's so draining. It is absolutely so draining. And there's this thing of we always have to be strong, right? And it is just something that I don't think I had ever had an appreciation of, obviously, as a 10-year-old. What am I going to appreciate? But growing up here, it's that much more important to have sisterhood groups. It's that much more important for me to check in on my sister. It's that much more important for me to have an open dialogue with my mother about things that traditionally we usually would never have conversations about, right? We are opening up ourselves. And I think this generation, my sister and I and our cousins, are forcing a generational shift with our parents who certain things would be taboo to talk about. Because we're saying, we can't afford this. We can't afford to say, but we're Kenyan, so we don't talk about these things. We're Kenyan, so we don't talk about these things to our fathers. No, my dad has the utmost privilege to be the father of 2 daughters. He's going to hear everything from me about what it is to be me. And it's the only way that he can help me as a father, is to be able to understand what I'm going through in some capacity. He'll never be me, but he can't help me if he doesn't know. So we've pushed that boundary to say, I don't care what traditionally is taboo. Don't care. We don't have that luxury. My mental health depends on you being able to know what I'm going through. So yeah, so it's heavy at times to be a Black woman. I think it's additionally heavy to be a Black professional woman because you understand what quicksand you stand on. You understand how careful you have to be to not jeopardize your livelihood.
Can you talk a little bit more about that?
I had this conversation with my parents and my aunt the other day about the dream we have been sold. Coming from Kenya, again, Pan-African generation of the 60s said, if you go to school and you work hard, and you go to school and you get good grades, ... which usually meant you'll come back to your country, you'll probably be a minister of finance or something or other, and you will be this affluent person. Fast forward, my parents, and their generation tell you the same thing. You got to get your education. They can never take away your knowledge. You just got to work hard. What they didn't know was it didn't matter. You can go to school and work hard and do all these things, and you're still Black. And you're still vulnerable. And you're still not insulated. And you're still not an exception. You're not an exception to what could happen to you on the streets. And, whether it was living in Baltimore, right? I easily could also die of gun violence in Baltimore, a drive-by shooting, just for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, or driving down the street, whatever. It didn't matter. And so this conversation of, I get to where I was supposed to go. I did everything right? I went to school. I went to law school. I got good grades. I'm employed. I'm self-sufficient. I'm all these things. But then you realize the higher you climb, you have such an investment, right? I have school loans from here to yesterday. And not any job will do to pay those off. See what I'm saying? And so I've climbed so far up. I've climbed so close to the sun, as they would say. It's so bright and it'll burn you. And with that also comes some freedoms that are stripped, which you realize are your ability to speak up and speak out. You get silent. I think it's different for people who enter a professional world in organizations and industries where there are more minorities in those industries, right? I think you see this sometimes with journalists. I think you see this sometimes, especially with journalists in newsrooms who are forced to wear their hair a certain way, take certain stories. Because look at your newsroom structure, right? Yeah. What is your option to speak up and say what? You'll get out of a job tomorrow. And there's so many people there like, listen, you could get out of a job tomorrow and blackballed from the whole industry. You can't afford that. When you look at lawyers, unless you're in a law firm that has other people who look like you toe that line. Look at politics, right? If you have any aspirations to climb higher, some dues you got to pay. If you look at, other private sector industries, you look at the board structure, you look at the leadership. These people, other people are responsible for your promotions. They are responsible for your, forward progress, as it were. And you have to toe it. And it's another form of silencing that happens that you don't realize is happening. But you look at that and you say, I'm not in a position to write my checks yet, right? I'm not Oprah. And Oprah is not my aunt, and she ain't my godmother. I wish she was. But until you are Oprah and you have your own show and you have your own platform and you write your own checks, you can't just say anything you want. You can't do that. If you're not another, say like a Don Lemon who brings in enough ratings, he can get away with some of the rants he does because he's like, I bring in the crowd, right? There's an empowerment to that. When you're just starting off in your career or your middle management, you don't have that power. You don't have it. But the worst part is you have too much to lose, I think is what somebody told me this week. They said, when you're a manager at McDonald's, and not to denigrate, but when you haven't reached a certain level, you can say anything. You still feel just as free. I'm in this middle. I'm not high enough to write my own check, and I'm not low enough, as it were, to not have any student debts. And so I'm like, I don't care, whatever. And I'm painfully aware of a society that is so interconnected that the word can get around by midday if I said something. And next thing I know, it won't be said it. Nobody will say it outright, but I will be blackballed. I will be blacklisted. And even though people won't admit to it outright, that's exactly what will happen when you go from one interview to the next, to another interview, to another interview, because everybody knows everybody. And that's a hardship, because at a time like this, you wonder what's your outlet. I'm as angry as everybody else who's protesting on the streets. I'm as angry as everybody else, with Twitter fingers out there. But I even watch what I tweet. I watch what I say. I watch what I write. And so there's a lot of residual emotion that I have to find other outlets for it. And unfortunately, that usually comes with friends. And then it's like, I always start with prefacing to my friends, I'm like, I'm so sorry to dump this on you, because they have enough stuff to deal with too, but they're the only outlet.
But I think it's so important to hear that, and it's so important to share that as well, because I think if we harbor a lot of stories and don't share them, it's very, very hard to understand what's wrong, what are the things that we need to change as a society, not from a purely altruistic standpoint, but also from the standpoint, how do we release those tensions that we have in our communities and our societies?
Right.
How do we get rid of all this anger or reduce all this anger and fear at the same time? And I don't know what's worse, to be honest with you, whether it's fear or anger. Let me ask you this. What do you think by we I maybe like white people are not getting correctly or not understanding as part of the discussion that's happening right now?
I would say that a lot of people are trying to come at this from the middle of the story. Right? You have to go to the beginning. I think trying to understand what you're seeing as if it's just something that you need to roll back just to 5 years or 8 years, right? This does not start with Trayvon Martin. It does not. This does not start with the creation of the Black Lives Matter movement. It does not. It is that you have to be willing to close the gap that education left for you, right? It's this now understanding that the schools don't teach everyone's history. They teach revisionist history. And so it's the understanding that in order for you to understand today, you need to go all the way back. All the way back. Because to your point, you can't possibly understand my anger or my rage or my frustration, because it's not a thing of 5 years ago. When people say, why can't Black people get over slavery? To your point, you need to understand how long people have been angry for. And how can an anger last 400 years? You need to understand how the treatment over 400 years has compounded upon itself to reach the fever pitch that it is today. So to think that people can just roll back 10 years and get the full picture, no, absolutely not. It's not even civil rights movement. You need to go beyond Martin Luther King. You need to go all the way back. I think that's one thing. I think the other thing is we have to have a reckoning about, and an honest one, about what is your fear about, right? This constant question that nobody ever answers. What is it about Black men that makes people so afraid? What is it? Because what is it about that person that is so different from when I look at you? Why should I not grab my purse tighter when I see you on the street? Why should I not cross the sidewalk when I see you on the street? What is it inherently about a Black man? Because it's not about a certain Black man, right? You don't even know this Black man. Any Black man will do. You put a Black man in front of people, they're afraid. What is it? What is it about him that makes you feel so threatened? And I think addressing that fear and then asking yourself, did you come up with that? Or is it something you were taught? Is it something somebody told you?
Interesting. I think that goes to a large extent back to what you and I talked about earlier, a lot of propagated messages and images.
Yeah.
And again, I came to this country 16 years ago. I didn't grow up here, but from what I'm hearing and seeing, it's less based on a fact or on a situation where somebody been in than on a perception. To this, let me ask you this. When somebody says all lives matter in response to Black Lives Matter, when somebody says, well, white lives matter as well, and Chinese lives matter as well, and so on and so on, what do you say to a person like that?
I would say English matters and words matter. So when we said Black Lives Matter, we didn't say only Black Lives Matter. Right? The phrase is Black Lives Matter, full stop, period, the end. Nobody said only Black Lives Matter. Black lives still matter. Right? All it says was Black Lives Matter, which again shows you that prejudices and biases completed that sentence above and beyond for other people than what was there. Right? How sometimes we say that our minds complete for us as muscle memory what's not there. So sometimes when you're proofreading something, you don't notice an error because your mind filled it in and it looks like it was correct. So same thing is, nobody said they don't, but it's the idea that if you don't have to fear for your safety, if you don't have to have this conversation of, I'm really angry right now about all this, but I can't take this to my job, or I can't do this. If you have to second guess how you dress, how you look, how you talk, if you have to second guess how you compose your resume, because you have studied the implications of unconscious bias and how people review your resume, because my name betrays me at the top. Unless I marry somebody with a last name Richardson or Johnson, you know who I am. And I have studied those things to elevate my resume on a pile because I know what happens, in terms of hiring practices. So we're not saying they don't matter. What we're saying is, until you get to understand that no accolade, no education, no Kenyanism can ever insulate me from being seen as just another Black person in America, then you don't understand how your life can quickly be snuffed out despite doing everything right. So my life matters in the same way that George Floyd's life matters. Because what we're saying is we will equally fight for your life if somebody treated you the way we were being treated. Look at the man who got shoved, the 75-year-old man. Not a single Black person said, let's not talk about him. If anything, people said, this is why we say Black Lives Matter, because now you also need to understand we're fighting for him as well, for those police to be held accountable, because he also should not be treated that way. Nobody said you don't support him, right? What we're saying is we're not on even footing. We're not. I had an incident just 2 weekends ago. Went to a bank to ask for to open an account and to get a house loan. The bank representative assumed my credit score was in the 600s. Didn't even, instead of asking me what it was, he said, what is it, a 640, 650? I said, no, it's a 796. He's like, oh, that's good. I'm like, no, actually, it's excellent. We're talking about systemic things. Unless I can get to the point of walking into a bank and you just, believe that I can be worth excellence, that I can, not have a car note, not have credit card debt, and have a 796 credit score, until it's not unfathomable to you that those things can happen, then we're not on equal footing. Unless I can go outside and not worry about being stopped, we're not on equal footing. And what would happen to me as a result of that? I remember my parents moving to Florida right after Trayvon Martin was killed. And you don't understand the fear I had of my father driving in that state, living in California. I was like, Dad, I think you just need to move out of Florida. Until you realize it's not a Florida thing, it's everywhere. But I had an intense fear that he would be one of those people. And now I have a mother on the other side of the world worrying for me and my sister. This is more than COVID. This is more than anything else. It's a daily anxiety. So yeah, everybody's life is valuable. But until we start to be seen as people worth life in every way, in infant mortality for African American women, you know, in terms of healthcare disparities and how we're treated in healthcare, in terms of economics, and like I just said, just going to the bank and being treated fairly, in terms of education, not being suspended and expelled at the rates that Black children are, in terms of just presumption. Why can't you presume I'm a good person before you start, you know, thinking that everything else of me? I think until we get to that point, we can't I think that's what people are saying. Until we get to that point, we can't possibly say all lives matter, because Black lives have an asterisk next to them. Black lives matter unless what? What deserves the justice of death? What? And there's a legal system to do that. If what I did is deserving of a death case, of a death penalty in the states where that's still the case, then let the system give it to me. Let the judicial system give it to me. What we're saying is we don't even get to jail. We don't even get to the courtroom. We don't make it past the sidewalk, right? If my life matters except, then all lives don't matter. Except what? That's the other thing I want to hear. Black lives matter except what? So then tell us which Black lives matter to you. The ones that have JDs and MBAs? Did Obama's life matter? Because he still got nooses and death threats. And he was educated, president, Harvard Law Review. What more could he have done? What more? His crime was just being Black and having the audacity to be the first Black Harvard Law Review editor. What else? What else could he have done to not get this hate? So it makes others of us feel we'll never do enough because he did it all. Short of being the King of England, he did it all. I will never, by virtue of not being born here, I will never be president. So that means Barack Obama has something on me. I'll never be president. So what more can I do to not get a noose with my effigy on it? To not have my children harassed? To not have my wife, you know, put akin to an ape, as we saw? To not be called a terrorist, giving my wife a terrorist, you know, fist jab? What more could we do? So which Black lives matter and which ones don't? So let's be clear. So anybody who says all lives matter, I want you to tell me why you think some Black lives don't matter. Which ones are those? Because Black mothers in America would like to know so that their kids don't get killed. I think
this is great.
It's such a deep-rooted anxiety that I think it's also the whataboutism culture. I find that to be almost at every turn. Well, what about? Really? It's always this thing about making it about yourself, right?
Maybe you can explain what you're referring. Give me an example.
Well, when you say Black Lives Matter, well, what about? Why can't that just be a full stop? Right? So let's say you're standing with a friend of yours, and I say to your friend, "Oh, nice haircut," and you look at me and say, "What about my haircut?" Really? Why is it about you? Who said yours wasn't nice? But this need, this narcissism, that unless it's about you and tied to you, a statement can't be valid on its own, right? Nobody said your hair wasn't fabulous just because I complimented the friend next to you, right?
This is great, Hilda. This is awesome. I really appreciate it. You and I have covered a lot of ground. We talked about a lot of things. Now, do you feel like there's something that we haven't talked about that we should have talked about?
Yeah. So I would say if I have one message that I think I've been thinking about this last week is there are people who are genuinely interested in participating in change and action. And I think all too often, we as a Black community get caught up in tokens and token support. And I think we saw this 2 weeks ago with congressmen and women wearing the kente cloth while introducing legislation. The entire day's conversation was who gave them the kente cloth. And come to find out, it was the Congressional Black Caucus. Irrelevant. Focus on what's important. And this idea that when people put out statements of solidarity, that's all it takes. No, it doesn't. So my message right now is two things. This is about action. This is not about token support. I don't need your statements of solidarity. I don't need companies upon companies to put out statements. Because here's the thing. I can't put those statements on my body the next time I'm stopped by a police officer and say, wait a minute. Amazon supports me. Walmart supports me. Nike supports me. Tamir Rice was gunned down in 2 seconds flat. Couldn't even have said his name fast enough. 2 seconds. I don't have the luxury to start saying, but wait, these companies support me. They stand with me. Ridiculous. So it's not about that. I think people need to listen and listen clearly. And if it's not being said, ask it. What is the change the Black community wishes to see? We're seeing a lot of these token support of statements. We don't need statements. We're telling you we need equality, we need equity, we need reform in our policies. The same way we had the 13th Amendment brought in order for the South to not subjugate Black people continuously after the Civil War period into slavery, that was an action that was needed. It was needed. Otherwise, this would have perpetuated on and on. At this moment, it is not enough to just say, I'm part of the change, because ask the community what it means and listen. Because there is a time where this momentum will die off, as everything naturally does. And only certain things can be passed in this period of fervor that we're in. And I think if we miss the opportunity to pass certain legislation, as we saw with the federal anti-lynching bill, once we start getting into times of peace and calm, those laws are harder to pass. So people signing on to those, San Diego had a huge, I think it was a 7-hour plus debate on police reform and where the funding would go. That is the action we're asking for in the community. It is about access to education. It is about funding for education. It's about funding for community resources, mental health resources, community policing. We need to focus on the bigger picture, the actual action items that actually save lives. Health disparities, people in the medical profession, whether it's training, whether it's funding, whatever it is. We need to make sure that Black people who go into hospitals come out. That they come out. Nobody should be dying in this day and age in the United States because a doctor didn't listen to them post-pregnancy or post-birth. That's not okay. So for me, I'm the most skeptic and cynical person you'll meet when people say, but we issued a statement. What's that going to do for me? I mean, in the same way that when I'm stopped by a police officer, I'm wearing a t-shirt. Nothing about me says lawyer. Nothing. So this debate that people had about Mr. Cooper in New York City, but he's a Harvard graduate. And he was about to die in New York City's park had he not done what he did. We don't wear our regalia on us, so we're not exempt from death because of who we are and our education. So statements are not going to save me. My education is not going to save me. But laws will. Policies will. Recalibrating how we teach and the awareness that we have will. And I think that's something that, I think should be discussed more. And anybody who's well-meaning, think about what you're doing and the audience you're doing it for. Are you doing it for your stakeholders, or are you actually doing it for the benefit of the people whose lives you're trying to save?
This is great, Hilda. Thank you very much. This is awesome.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you so much for doing this and for having this project. I really, really do appreciate it.